Hello and welcome to the debut episode of the Sharp Case Files. I'm your host, Derek Sharp. Today, we're going to take a look at a case that has a lot of questions, a lot of controversy, and a family that continued standing by their son even after his conviction. This is the story of Chris. As we go through this case, I'm going to break down what happened, what investigators found, what Chris and his family claimed, and what happened after the conviction. Some of the details we're going to talk about are disturbing. So, with that said, let's get into the case. This is the Sharp Case Files. Cases. We're going to talk about Chris Coleman, a husband, a father, a man who came from a religious family and was raised by pastors, and ultimately, a man who was convicted of murdering his wife, Sherry, and their two sons, Garrett and Gavin. But this case isn't just about the murders. It's about the threats that came before them. It's about the investigation. It's about the evidence. It's about the claims made after the conviction. And it's also about the people who continued defending Chris even after he was found guilty. And honestly, that's one of the parts of this case that I find the hardest to understand. Because when someone is convicted of something this serious, you're left asking yourself one very simple question. How could the people closest to him continue believing he was innocent? That's what we're going to get into. So, grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's take a look at one of the most disturbing cases I've covered. This is the Sharp Case Files.
I'm Derek Sharp.
And this is the Coleman case. Back to the beginning. It's May 5, 2009 in Columbia, Illinois. Chris Coleman leaves his home and heads to the gym. At least, that's what he said happened. When he later became concerned that his wife wasn't answering the phone, police were called to the house. And what they found inside was horrifying. Sherry Coleman, 31, and her two sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were dead inside their home. All three had been strangled. But this wasn't just a random break-in. There were messages spray-painted throughout the house. Threatening messages. Messages that appeared to suggest someone was targeting Chris and his family. And that was important because Chris had already reported receiving threats before the murders. Police had been called about threatening emails and notes, including messages that referenced his work with Joyce Meyer Ministries. First, that sounds like a terrifying situation. Someone is threatening your family. You report it to police. Then, suddenly, your wife and children are murdered. So investigators had to ask a very important question. Who was threatening Chris Coleman? Was there actually someone out there targeting this family? Or was something else going on? Because as investigators started digging deeper, the story began to change. And this is where the case gets really interesting. Police eventually discovered evidence indicating that some of the threatening communications had actually come from Chris Coleman's own laptop. The messages that were supposed to make it look like someone was stalking and threatening the family were now pointing back toward Chris himself. And investigators weren't stopping there. They also began looking at Chris's personal life. Because while Chris was presenting himself as a husband and father who was being targeted by some unknown enemy, investigators discovered that he had been having an affair. And according to court documents, Chris had been communicating with another woman about their relationship and plans for the future. Now, I'm not saying an affair automatically makes someone a murderer. It doesn't. But when you're investigating the murder of someone's wife and children, and you discover that person was having an affair, wanted a different life, and had allegedly been creating a trail of threats against himself and his family, investigators are obviously going to take a very hard look at that. And that's exactly what happened. The investigation started pulling apart the story Chris had originally given police. The threats. The emails. The spray-painted messages. The timeline. His relationship with Sherry. And eventually, the evidence prosecutors presented would paint a very different picture from the one Chris had originally described. The question was no longer simply, who killed Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin? Investigators really started putting the pieces together. The threats were supposed to make it look like Chris and his family had been targeted by some unknown person. But investigators discovered that at least some of those threatening emails had originated from Chris's own laptop. And that changes everything. Because now investigators weren't just looking for a mysterious stalker. They were looking at Chris Coleman. And then there was the spray paint. investigators found that the same type of red spray paint used inside the Coleman home had been purchased by Chris. Prosecutors also presented handwriting evidence connecting Chris to the messages painted throughout the house. Think about that for a second. Someone supposedly breaks into your home, murders your wife and children, and leaves threatening messages behind. But then investigators start finding evidence that points back to you. That's not exactly the story Chris wanted police to believe. And then investigators started looking at Chris's relationship with another woman. Chris had been having an affair with Tara Lintz, who had been a friend of Sherry's. According to testimony reported at the time, Lintz told investigators that Chris had discussed divorcing Sherry. She also said she had spoken with him the night before the murders. And here's where things get even more disturbing. According to prosecutors, Chris didn't simply wake up one morning and decide he wanted a different life. They argued that the murders were the end result of months of planning. The prosecution alleged that Chris had created the threatening messages, purchased the spray paint, and built a story around the idea that someone was coming after his family. The defense, of course, had a different explanation. They argued that someone else could have had access to Chris's computer and that the evidence didn't prove he was responsible for the threats or the murders. And that's important to remember. Chris maintained his innocence. But prosecutors had another major problem for him. The timeline. Chris told police that Sherry was alive when he left the house for the gym on the morning of May 5, 2009. But investigators said the autopsies indicated that Sherry and the boys had been killed hours earlier, sometime between approximately 11 p.m. on May 4th and 3 a.m. on May 5th. So the story investigators were building was becoming very different from the story Chris had given them. The family wasn't necessarily killed by some mysterious stranger who happened to break into the house. Instead, prosecutors argued that Chris had created the appearance of an outside threat and then killed his own family. And 2 years after Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin were found dead, Chris Coleman went on trial. The prosecution had to convince 12 jurors that all of these pieces, the threats, the emails, the spray paint, the affair, and the timeline weren't just coincidences. They had to convince them that they were looking at a carefully constructed story. And now, the question was no longer just who did it. The question was, would the jury believe the prosecution's story? Because after everything investigators had uncovered, Chris Coleman was about to face the people who would ultimately decide his fate. And now we get to the part of the case where all of those questions were put in front of a jury. Chris Coleman went to trial in 2011, roughly 2 years after Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin were murdered. And by this point, prosecutors had built a case around a pretty disturbing theory. They argued that Chris had created the appearance of an outside threat because he wanted people to believe that someone else was coming after his family. The threatening emails, the spray-painted messages, the affair, the timeline. All of these pieces were presented to the jury as part of a larger plan. And Chris's defense wasn't backing down. His attorneys argued that the evidence didn't prove he was the person responsible. They challenged the computer evidence and suggested that someone else could have accessed his laptop. Chris himself continued maintaining his innocence. But after hearing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Guilty. Chris Coleman was convicted of murdering his wife, Sherry, and their 2 sons, Garrett and Gavin. He was ultimately sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. And just like that, the man who had spent years presenting himself as the victim of an unknown stalker was now convicted of killing the very family he had claimed he was trying to protect. But here's where this story gets even more complicated. Because a conviction didn't end the debate surrounding Chris Coleman. Chris continued saying he was innocent, and his parents continued believing him. That's something we're going to come back to, because honestly, this is where the case becomes almost as much about the family surrounding Chris as it is about Chris himself. His parents didn't look at the conviction and say, "Our son did something terrible." They continued fighting for him. They continued speaking publicly. And they continued arguing that Chris had been wrongfully convicted. So now we've got a convicted murderer sitting in prison, still saying he didn't do it, and parents who are still standing beside him. But Chris wasn't finished trying to prove his innocence. He would eventually challenge his conviction through the appeals process. And that brings us to the next chapter of this case. Because even after a jury said guilty, Chris Coleman wasn't ready to stop fighting. And neither was his family. He is sitting in prison. 3 life sentences. No possibility of parole. And you would think that, at this point, the case would be over. But Chris wasn't done. He continued maintaining that he was innocent and began challenging his conviction. And this is where some of the claims surrounding Chris and his family get really strange. Chris argued that there wasn't enough evidence to prove he was responsible for the murders. One of the arguments involved his laptop. Chris claimed that Sherry could have accessed the computer and sent some of the threatening emails herself. The problem with that argument is pretty obvious. Sherry was dead. So investigators and prosecutors had to look at the technical evidence and determine who actually created and sent those messages. And then there was another claim. Chris and his father, Ron, claimed there was video showing a mysterious person leaving a threatening letter in the family's mailbox. If true, that could have been extremely important, because it would potentially support Chris's argument that someone else had been threatening the family. But here's the problem. When people wanted to see that evidence, it apparently wasn't available. No video that could be produced. No letter that could independently prove the story. And no physical evidence that suddenly revealed some mystery person was responsible. At that point, you're left asking yourself, if you have evidence that could potentially prove your son was innocent, why can't anyone see it? That's one of the questions that really stands out to me when looking at this case. Because it's one thing to say, we believe he's innocent. It's another thing to say, we have evidence that proves it. Those are 2 very different things. And Chris's family continued to defend him. His father, Ron, was particularly vocal. Ron was a minister at Grace Church, and according to reports, he even spoke about Chris's conviction from the pulpit. He reportedly suggested that the devil himself had played a role in Chris being convicted, and that there was a larger effort against the Christian church. And I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how you make sense of that. Because at some point you have to separate faith from evidence. You can believe in your son. You can love your son. You can stand beside your son. But none of that changes the evidence presented in court. And it certainly doesn't change the fact that 3 people lost their lives. Sherry, Garrett, Gavin. A wife and 2 children. 3 lives that can never be brought back. Meanwhile, Chris remained behind bars, still claiming that he had been wrongfully convicted. And eventually, his appeal reached another major turning point. In 2020, Chris's appeal was denied. His conviction remained in place. His mother, Connie, died that same summer. And Ron continued defending his son. So even after all those years, the family wasn't giving up on Chris. And that's something I keep coming back to. Because this isn't just a story about a murder conviction. It's also a story about what happens when the people closest to someone refuse to accept the possibility that they could have done something horrific. And maybe that's understandable. Parents don't want to believe their child is capable of something like this. But understanding why someone believes something doesn't necessarily make that belief true. And that's where I'm going to leave the case for tonight. Because there is one thing I want to make absolutely clear. Having bad parents does not excuse murder. Whatever Chris's childhood was like, whatever problems existed inside that family, whatever mistakes his parents may have made, none of that excuses the murder of a wife and 2 children. 3 people died. And their lives deserve to be remembered beyond the man who was convicted of killing them.
I'm Derek Sharp.
This has been the Sharp Case Files. Thank you for listening to the debut episode. And I'll see you in the next case.